Hello, everybody, and very good morning to you. My name is Don Arleth, and you're watching World Talks here on TVP World. Today, a Turkish court is set to decide whether to annul the main opposition party's Congress, a move that could oust party leader Özgür Özel. On Sunday, tens of thousands of supporters of the party protested in Ankara against what they called abuses of power by President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan's government. Joining me now is Richard Giragosian, founding director of the Regional Studies Center. Hello, sir, and thank you very much for joining us this morning on TVP World.
Thank you, Don.
Now, let's start with the case itself. What is at stake in this court ruling on the CHP Congress, and why does it matter right now?
Well, unfortunately, this is only the latest in a deeper trend as the Turkish government moves its country further away from democracy. What we see are two specific observations here. One is the Turkish government is clearly in a position of insecurity rather than confidence. Secondly, and more importantly, after 22 years in power, Turkish President Erdoğan seems to be weakening. And the weaker the legitimacy of the government, the stronger this crackdown against any opposition. And largely the stakes are high. The future of democracy in Turkey is clearly at the hands of a now weaponized judiciary.
Protests. We've seen these mass protests on the streets, in various cities in Turkey. What did we see yesterday? What was the atmosphere?
Well, what we see is a robust popular reaction of resistance, resisting the authoritarian policies of the government. This not only demonstrates the popularity of the opposition and the weakness of the government, but also demonstrates the popular commitment to preventing this retreat from democracy. At the same time, however, I'm not sure it's going to be enough. It may be too little too late, given the broader trend of authoritarian power in today's Turkey.
So what can we expect further? If this, in your opinion, isn't enough, where does this conclude, I guess?
Well, this is the problem, where to judge the tipping point lies. In other words, the Turkish government continues to escalate its attacks on the opposition. But this may be the crucial tipping point in going too far too fast. And in this context, we do see on a municipal, local level, a tremendous outpouring of support for the opposition. And I do think a judiciary that is compliant and unfortunately abetting the policies of the Erdoğan government may actually be the newest target. So I do think the ruling of the court today will actually determine whether this escalates into a genuine fundamental crisis on the streets, triggering more opposition demonstrations.
Wow, okay, so something definitely to pay attention to. Now, to what extent does this reflect a broader pattern of using the judiciary as a political tool against the opposition there in Turkey?
Well, unfortunately, in a standard model of authoritarian countries, the judiciary and parliaments are actually specifically targeted by a sometimes charismatic but strong leader like President Erdoğan, who's been in power for 22 years. Whether it's in the United States, whether it's in Hungary or today's Turkey, we do see a challenge to the institutions of democracy, the checks and balances. And unfortunately for the judiciary, this is as much a challenge to their legitimacy as it is to a challenge to overall political stability in Turkey.
Now, how does this case compare to the earlier ruling that sidelined the Istanbul mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu? Are we seeing systematic strategy at work?
Unfortunately, yes. What we saw with the targeting of the popular opposition mayor of Istanbul, Imamoglu, we also see the targeting of democratically elected local municipal leaders, especially in the east of Turkey. And the one remaining figure beyond the leader of the CHP is the mayor of Ankara, who's also equally respected and popular, but poses a significant opposition challenge to Erdogan. But the key difference here is in the timing. Years ago, President Erdogan was confident in a strong position. However, he is greatly weakened over his 24 years in power, and those around him may actually be escalating this crisis in order to keep their own power.
Now, if Özgür Özel is removed as party leader, what impact could that have on CHP's internal stability?
Unfortunately, it would be tremendously negative, not just in terms of losing its new leader, but any kind of jailing or punishment of the current leader would mean that the previous leader of the opposition, CHP, the failed presidential candidate in the past, would attempt to regain his lost leadership position. And he's widely discredited, unfortunately. So it would weaken the party in terms of an even less effective leadership after this decision.
Now, how might ordinary Turkish citizens interpret this move? Could it deepen political apathy, or does it risk backfiring by galvanizing the opposition support?
I would say the risk of apathy is very low, namely because polarization is the natural reaction as the government has escalated its attack on democratic institutions and its targeting of the opposition. But one thing we didn't talk about that's equally important is the economics of governance. And it's really the economic pain, the austerity, and the negative economic developments, especially over the past several years of the Erdogan government, that is actually key to determining the future of Erdogan's government. In other words, it's bread and butter issues. It's daily economics that are equally important as the political crisis widens.
Yes, people often vote with their wallets, don't they? And that determines the level of happiness in a society. What signals does this send to Turkey's international partners, for instance? Particularly the EU and the US, about the state of Turkish democracy and the rule of law?
Well, unfortunately, today's court ruling will be specifically targeting Turkey's reputation, credibility, and image in the West. Unfortunately, the European Union has already witnessed Turkey's backsliding, moving away from European ideals and a retreat from democracy. For the Trump administration, this may only bring the two leaders closer together, given developments in Washington. But nevertheless, I do think Turkey on the world stage is increasingly looking feeble politically and much less reliable as a stable partner.
Well, definitely developments that we will be paying close attention to. Richard Giragosian, founding director at the Regional Studies Center, thank you so much for joining us and enlightening us on this very difficult subject. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Don.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.